Good evening, friends. I'm Vikas Kumar, Director of GemArts, and on behalf of GemArts and our partners here at NCLA and Blood Act Books, welcome to Masala Festival 2023. Now, in its 8th year, the award-winning Masala Festival is back celebrating South Asian creativity and cultural goodness, bringing to venue spaces in the Northeast the very best regional, national and international artists. The festival began on Monday, and we had an amazing response so far. So whoever's in the audience and have been supporting us over the last few days, thank you very much for coming and showing up. That's fantastic. But we've still got loads of incredible events coming up, including Topographies, a South Asian film short at Baltic on Saturday, Fabricated, a visual arts exhibition at the New Bridge Project by Sajal Kaleem, who's an exceptional emerging talent. So please go and see her work as well. Actually, is she in the audience? There she is, there's Sajal. She's fantastic, really. Go and see her work at New Bridge. For music lovers, Masala Festival is collaborating with BBC Proms at Sage Gator tomorrow for a late night special extraordinary music performed by two leading lights of the British jazz scene, Yaz Ahmed and Aaron Ghosh. Early in the day, hopefully the rain will stop as well. We've got an incredible performance on Grey Street, a Kathak and live music performance by Amina Khayyam company, which is You and Me, which celebrates LGBTQ South Asian lives. So please go on. Well, it's at 12:30, 2:30 and 4:30 at the minute, but the rain might disrupt that, so we'll let, just come along in any case. And the festival culminates on the 23rd of July with our fantastic mini-mela for children and families at Bench and Grove Community Centre. Plus, there's loads more events, performances, and workshops, which you can find in our beautiful Masala Festival brochure here. So that's enough of the plug in any case for the rest of the festival. Well, I'll sort of say what we're here for in any case. So we're delighted to continue our partnership with Newcastle Centre for Literary Arts to bring award-winning and the very best poets from the South Asian diaspora. And this year is no exception, as we launch Out of Sri Lanka, a new anthology of Sri Lankan and diaspora poetry published by Blood Axe Books. We're thrilled to feature at this year's Masala Festival the three co-editors, Vidyan Ravinthiran, Seni, Seneviratne, and Shash Trevett, in conversation with our host, Professor Preti Teneja, Director of NCLA. I won't say too much now, as Preti will be introducing the poets and we'll be in conversation with them. We're in for a fantastic evening. And I just want to take this opportunity because, I'm in a really privileged position to stand up here as well, but to make this festival happen, it takes a lot of people and a lot of effort as well. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all the artists, producers, participants, volunteers, our trustees at GemArts, our partners and sponsors across the whole festival. A special thanks to Arts Council in England for their continued and valuable support. Thank you to NCLA, Melanie and Priti, all the tech staff, all the front of house staff as well, and all the team, to Neil Astley at Blood Axe Books, and to the poets Vidyan, Shash and Seni for their partnership and collaboration to realise this event tonight. And last but never least, to my amazing GemArts team, Annalisa, Narinda, Zara, Prapal and Izzy, were small but mighty, and for all their brilliant hard work and their commitment. So sit back, enjoy the evening, and I'll now hand over to Priti. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Preti Teneja, and I'm Professor of World Literature and Creative Writing here at Newcastle University and Director of NCLA. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. I've been to two absolutely outstanding events in the GemArts Masala Festival already this week, and I know that given our readers and their work, that this one is going to stand alongside those. As Vic has said, it's an extraordinary privilege for me to stand to introduce him and this groundbreaking book, which brings together Sri Lankan poets from across the country and the diaspora, curated with care, energy, sensitivity and insight by the three editor poets who are with us tonight. So to begin, I'm going to say a few words about the format of the evening and the book itself. First, we're going to see a short film bringing together some of the voices who can't be with us tonight and whose work is published in a book. Then we're going to hear from our poet editors in turn. For your enjoyment, I'm going to introduce them all now, and then we can immerse ourselves in the readings, followed by a short Q&A with me, and I hope with time to answer some of your questions. There will be a chance to mingle and chat to the poets at the end. Please buy a book and have it signed as you do so. So to say something briefly about this remarkable work is to pay tribute to the enormous effort and intellectual achievement of the three editors and poets of Sri Lankan heritage who've grown up in different decades and with different life experiences and have brought together such a range of voices at this important time for the country. Many of you will know Sri Lanka's beauty, but also the violence that has marred it and that has affected all its communities, religious, ethnic, gender, linguistic. You will know that it is a country of many languages and a colonial and imperial history at brutal British, but also Indian and Portuguese hands. Across the diaspora, Sri Lankan voices are rarely heard in the South Asian mix. Tonight is a chance to think with and through those issues with three of its finest writers, who I'm really excited to say are meeting in person together for the first time here tonight. So to begin with Vidyan Ravinthiran, he was born to Sri Lankan Tamils in Leeds and now teaches at Harvard. He is the author of two collections of poetry, Grunthu Malani, also published by Blood Axe, and The Million-Petaled Flower of Being Here, which won the Northern Writers Award, was a PBS recommendation and was shortlisted for the Forward and the T.S. Eliot Prizes. His study, Elizabeth Bishop's Prosaic, won both the University English Prize and the Warren Books Award for Outstanding Literary Criticism, and Poetry gave him the Editor's Prize for Reviewing. In 2022, Columbia University Press published Worlds Woven Together, a collection of essays and spontaneity and form in modern prose, which came out from OUP. Asian/Other, a fusion of poetry criticism and memoir, will be published by Icon in the UK and Northern in the US. Coming soon. Seneviratne is born in Leeds as well and currently living in Derbyshire. Seni is a writer of English and Sri Lankan heritage and published by People Tree Press. Her books include Wild Cinnamon and Winter Skin, The Heart of It, and Unknown Soldier, inspired by her father's experience as a signalman in the Second World War, which was a Poetry Book Society recommendation, a National Poetry Day choice, and highly commended in the Forward Poetry Prizes 2020. She has been widely published in several anthologies and magazines, and has collaborated with filmmakers, visual artists, musicians, and digital artists, and is one of 10 commissioned writers on the Colonial Countryside Project. She's a fellow of the Complete Works Programme for Diversity and Equality in British Poetry, and is currently working on an LGBTQ project with Sheffield Museums entitled Queering the Archive, and is completing her fourth collection, The Go Away Bird, which will be published by People Tree Press this autumn. And Shash Trevett was born in Manape in Northern Province in Sri Lanka. She is a poet, critic and translator of Tamil poetry into English. Harassed by both the Sri Lankan army and the LTTE, her father, being a prominent surgeon, was kidnapped several times and taken to operate on casualties on both sides under gunpoint. Her family sought refuge in India in 1984. Returning to their home in 1987 on the signing of the peace accord, she was brutally caught up in the atrocities committed by the Indian peacekeeping force. A staunch pacifist, she lives in the UK and writes almost exclusively about the Civil War and its aftermath on the lives of civilians. Shash is a winner of the Northern Writers Award. Her poetry has been widely published in the UK. Her debut pamphlet, From a Borrowed Land, was published in 2021 by Smith Dorstop, and her first collection is forthcoming in 2024, also from Smith Dorstop. So please join me in welcoming them all after we are going to watch this short film. Thank you so much.
The Civil War, September 1984. 3 months since I returned to Sri Lanka with an American college degree. The Civil War has spilled beyond the northern province. Metal gates to my parents' house still bear the dents of rock-throwing mobs. There are axe marks on the wooden doors. New plaster hides a ceiling charred by a burning tire. Embattled elsewhere, I relive the horror of July 1983 through my siblings' eyes. It is difficult to articulate the deep loss within, the negation of familiar fictions, the awareness that exile in one's own country is even less bearable than at a distance. It is a loss compounded by my family's fear. February 1985. Carrying the national ID card is mandatory. It will protect me from arbitrary arrest, they say. But the civil war has spilled beyond the northern province. Authorities have collapsed many identities into a Tamil last name. The card does not attest that I am also Sinhalese, speak no Tamil, and dream in English. It is silent on conflicting loyalties and the struggle to recover myself from colonialisms. I am reduced to someone else's definition, terrorized into keeping boundaries I neither constructed nor consented to. December 1985. Exile, 4 months in North America. White graduate classmates are puzzled that a 20th century South Asian might share the experiences of a medieval Jew. Their imagination stops at my brown skin. There has always been a civil war beyond the northern province. Those at risk cannot afford ignorance. I have learned to recognize the languages of domination and gather a community of resistance for a dangerous journey towards necessary transformations.
எல்லாவற்றையும் மறந்து விடலாம். எல்லாவற்றையும் மறந்து விடலாம். இந்த பாழும் உயிரை அனாதரவாக இழப்பதை வெறுத்து காலி வீதியில் தெருகும் ஒரு கணப்பொறியில் தெரித்த நம்பிக்கையோடு காலி வீதியில் திசைகளோடு இதயமும் குலுங்க விரைந்த போது கவிழ்க்கப்பட்டு வெளியே திரிந்த காரோடு ஆகாயத்திற்கும் பூமிக்கும் இடையில் எங்கோ ஒரு புள்ளியில் நிலைத்த கிளியொன்று வெளியே இல்லாமல் வெளியின் குழிக்குள் குருதி உறைந்திருந்தாய். டிக்மெண்ட் ரோட்டில் தலை கருப்பு பறிந்து ரத்த சிவப்பில் விளந்து கிடந்த 6 மனிதர்கள் தீயில் கருக தவறி ஒரு சேலை துணையிழந்து மணிக்கூடும் இல்லாமல் தனித்து போய் கிடந்த ஒரு இடது கையை எரிந்து கொண்டிருக்கும் வீட்டிலிருந்து தொட்டில் ஒன்றை சுமக்க முடியாமல் சுமந்து சென்ற ஒரு சிங்கள கர்ப்பிணி பெண்ணை எல்லாவற்றையுமே மறந்துவிடலாம். ஆனால் உன் குழந்தைகளை ஒழித்து வைத்த தேயிலை செடிகளின் மீது முகில்களும் இறங்கி மறைத்த அந்த பின்மாலையில் நீண்ட நாட்களுக்கு பிறகு கிடைத்த கொஞ்சம் அரிசியை பானையிலிட்டு சோறு பொங்கும் என்று ஒளிந்தபடி காத்திருந்த போது பிடுங்கி எறிவட்ட என் பெண்ணே, உடைந்த பானையையும் நிலத்தில் சிதறி உலர்ந்த சோற்றையும் நான் எப்படி மறக்க.
In lockdown. There's nothing to it, really. It's only day 351 of being truly alone, day 1650 or 1860 of wearing masks that are never really thrown away, and the bits of you under my nails stay unwashed by anything. isolation is a laugh. 2. Time moves across this wall in shadows, in a parade of ants, in stains shaped like dying animals, in 27 charcoal fingerprints, in peeling patches of age, creating maps of no place I've been. Tomorrow, we will observe ceilings. '21, in memory of 21st April 2018, Colombo. We trudge heavily through this daylight darkness, nodding half-heartedly at blackened people, dropping charred words onto burned hearts, watching greyly how the unalive bury their dead.
ආයුබෝවන් උතුරටත් දකුණටත් යුද උල්පත් මවන පාලක කැනිහිලුන් නසබඩ දිවිපිදූ යාපන පුස්තකාලය නුඹට මලගම් ලියූ උන් මෙලොව නැතුවාය යහතින් කිසිවෙකුත් නොවැසුව නඩුවකට තීන්දුව තිලින කොට ඇත සොබාදම් විනිසුරු තැන අවදියෙන් ඉනුමැන යලිදුවොයි සෙවණැලි පුනරාගමනය නොවන්නට මනු දහම ලියවුණු පොත්පත් තිරු තුලට කැවිය යුතුයමය කළු කුහර ගහන වූ ඉතිහාසය යලි යලිත් සිදු නොවිය යුතු රහස
In one point in time, the only fresh air that ever existed came from the balcony behind the Fox's room in hometown Rajgir. It had a stellar view, his balcony, with oddly arranged roofs of overly modest houses peppering the dark green marshes and dull flora overlooking the capital Corte. And in the near distance, bright lights from the tall pillars of success stories, lucky perseverance, and executive tricksters looked down at us sprats, swimming pathetically in a pond overpopulated with too many a fish bigger than us, feeding on their leftovers like the unfortunate beggars that we are. Here, some of us were still hopeful, for when the frying pan lights on, we'll get our chance to watch the big fish sear. Matara Bat Kale, lunchtime fantasy. But for now, we are just stargazing, or cloud gazing, depending on the hour. Thankful that the sun and moon both bless the land on all ends of prosperity in our young town, Rajgir.
மனோன்மணி அக்கா சின்ன மனுஷி புருஷன் கார்த்திகேசு நல்ல உயரம் சின்ன பொடிகளாகி எங்களுக்கு இவ்வேற்றுமை விசித்திரமாகப்பட்டது பிள்ளை ஒட்டு கிடையாது ஆனால் அதே போல ஒற்றுமையான தம்பதியை பார்க்கலாது இந்த சின்ன மனமணி அக்கா இப்படி 6 நாளாக அன்னந்தண்ணி இல்லாமல் கந்த சட்டி பிடிக்கிறார் என்று நான் வியந்ததுண்டு சொல்ல வந்தது அது வெல்ல மனோன்மணி அக்காவுக்கு ஒரு நாள் பூரான் கடிச்சு போட்டு பரியாரியார் ஒரு கை மருந்து சொன்னார் பல்லு விழாத பாலகன்ற சிறுநீர் பருகவான் எனக்கு அப்போ 7 வயது பல்லு விளையில்லை கையில் ஒரு கிண்ணியோட மனோன்மணி அக்கா பல்லை காட்டியபடி இங்கே வாராசா கொஞ்சம் கொஞ்சம் நான் பார்க்கல கொஞ்சம். நான் வீட்டை சுற்றி ஓடி திரிகிறேன் வெட்கத்தில். அவள் கேட்டதை நான் கொடுக்கலையே என்ற மன வருத்தம் இன்னமும் எனக்கு இருக்கு. மருந்துக்கும் மூத்திரம் பெய்யான் என்ற பழமொழி என்னோடு தான் வழங்கலாயிற்று.
නිත්‍යකලා නුඹේ ලියුම කඳුළු වැලක් වාගේ මට. ඒ මගේම කඳුළු නොවේද ඒ ලුණු රස. කිරිමවකගේ ඇඳිවත බඳු කිලිටි අහස් උකුලේ නිදන දියවක සඳ කවදා වියපත් වේවිද තුරුල්ලේම මිය යාවිද රත්තරනේ මට හරියට බෑ කියන්න. මහ කරුණා සෙවණැල්ලේ සිරිමාබෝ වැලි මළුවේ මරු වැල පෑගී වැටුණා මගේ අම්මා. නෙළුම් මල් අතින් අරගෙන නලල් තල ඇඳිලි බැඳගෙන. පිච්ච මල් සුවඳ වියැකෙන තල් ගස යට ඈ නිදි කරවා තබන්න එන්නද මම. නිත්‍යකලා කියන්න මට. මව් නැති අපි දෙදෙන දෙතැන. කඳුලින් කඳුලැලි සෝදන නිත්‍යකලා නුඹ සහ මම.
Circled by Circe. After 20 years muzzled in North London, you tell me over a cup of treasured Tangana tea, you have decided you must now go back. Back home to that repository of such complicated images to find a less constricting mask, an unthrottle, an old lion in your throat. You kneel before a temporarily placed music center. As the record spins, I listen and try to understand how you imagine your future will unravel from such a private past. You have been heading for this announcement over many years. Each time we met, your conversation grew more spiced, with images of gold sand, tamarind trees, the cacophony of traffic, lorries, cars, bullock carts, bicycles, rising out of the deep roar of the sea, soothing life in a Vellavatta boarding house. Have you found in Old Gaul Road a histogram for the poetics of development, a place for the dry knowledge you extracted from that heap of economics textbooks? How quickly they invaded those bookshelves that once encased armloads of dog-eared poetry and far-flung magic histories. For 20 years you dug your heels and watched the catkins' obstinate return. You inscribed Keats, Marx, Parnavitana on every inch of your eclectic skin to come finally to such disillusion. Now you say you must measure your roots and distance yourself from an increasingly hostile climate. It seems you must exchange one mirror image for its reverse. Confound exile and pin your hopes on a fragile memory of things as they might have been.
So on behalf of my co-editors and me, I'd like to thank everyone at GemArts, to thank Big Hass and Melanie and Preti for arranging this event and all the work they put into it, especially with the last minute changes to do with the train strikes and everything. And it certainly means a lot to me to be back in Newcastle where I married my wife a few years ago, and also to be here and meet Shash, my co-editor, for the very first time. Because we edited the book during the years of the pandemic and we'd meet on Zoom every day. Uncanny Valley. I should say actually first that the very first poet to read on the video was Yasmin Tambiar, who read that wonderful prose poem. Uncanny Valley. I had been walking further and further into a desert of yearning silicon. The air shimmered in oblongs already. You could hear voices crying out softly from thousands of viewless windows. Life without walls. Well, you need walls, load-bearing and beautiful, to fix the windows in. And you know her hair is never so beautiful as when she's crying out from the window and letting it down so you can scamper up. So much hair, so intricately braided and pinned that its sheer brush fire exerts little to no pull on the skin of the scalp, so you could go on climbing forever toward the mirage crashing and burning in the air, and her entreaties would never be those of pain. So I'm going to read two more poems by me. So each of us is going to read our 3 poems in the anthology and then some poems by another poet. So this poem's called Ceylon. It's a poem about tea. I mean, everyone knows about Sri Lanka and India and tea, England and tea. Trying to think of something new to say with this poem. Well, I will say it's very, very hard for me, in terms of speaking about one's traumas, it's very, very hard for me to move to America and still be a tea drinker. Because as you know, that Americans, a lot of them don't drink tea, a lot of them drink coffee. You'll know that many of them don't have kettles. But the kettles they do have, because of the lower voltage over there, they take, say, 30 seconds longer to reach boiling point. And if you're an English person or Sri Lankan person who really needs their tea, there's something about that I think is just, I know, first world problems, but it's awful. Right, so, Ceylon. Oh, and I mentioned a couple of poetic feet here. So an I am goes da-dum, and a trochee goes dum-da. Ceylon, the words on the tip of your tongue, or as you say it, tong, as we take tea. Waiting for you to speak, I sip mine. Tetley's tastes of nothing, but I suppose it's good to know true flavourlessness. The prose of life we sugar over with verse. Ceylon, you say, a trochee, not an I am, referring to the drink I drink with 2 spoonfuls at home, and here, none. Though by home, I mean the house my parents live in and where I grew up. It's like and unlike them saying back at home when they intend Sri Lanka and not Leeds, where they live and I haven't, not for years. And this poem is called the Annapuraniyamal, which is the name of a ship which was bought by a sort of American entrepreneur in India and was sailed with an Indian and Sri Lankan crew all the way to Boston, where, and it occurred to me, having moved to that area myself, that it had a resonance with that, but also, of course, with the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth, or rather in the place that had its own native name, but they then decided to call Plymouth. So, the Annapuraniyamal, or Florence C. Robinson, a scaled-down copy of a full-rigged New England clipper, or a direct descendant of an early 19th century British naval brig. That Valvai Thoni plied long-known Tamil sea routes, made port from Cochin to Visakhapatnam, Aden to Rangoon, carried rice, spice, tiles and timber, sandalwood, teak, tobacco and dried fish, was purchased for as much paper money as filled the back of an ancient open Buick, sailed the Pumban Channel to Colombo, arrived in Gloucester, Mass. In August 1938. Her pilgrim crew, turbaned, beskirted, clomb the yards barefoot. A fine lot of men, too, if you treated them right and respected their beliefs, singing lusty sea shanties in an incongruous, fine word, incongruous, biblical English. So I really have to thank my uncle for that, who sent me the old news articles of that, so I was able to take phrases from them and turn them into a kind of found poem. So the other poet I'm going to read from, his name was Reggie Siriwardena, and Reggie writes his friend A.J. Seneviratne, who taught with him at the University of Jaffna, where he worked, he died in 2004, was interested not only in literature and the arts, he was a human rights activist, he was one of the founders of the civil rights movement, he was a student of politics, especially of the Soviet bloc, of astronomy, he was a champion of the equality of all races, multiculturalism and pluralism. In his political prose, he aspired to the clear democratic style of George Orwell. Analysing literature, he was an adventurous comparatist. He also wrote fiction and drama. You know, as we get to know more and more about the poets and the authors of fiction and so on from the global south, we often still analyse them using critics who are based at US or UK universities. So I want to try and do something with these professors and people who analyse literature and all this wonderful prose they wrote that doesn't get read anymore. But for the moment, let me read you a poem by him called Birthday Apology and Apologia. To have existed while the planet made 80 revolutions round the sun is no small achievement, but I must confess I am rather surprised to find myself still here. It's scandalous at 80 years to walk the earth where younger, better people now are dust and ashes. Thinking only of those who died of violence and had much more to give, Rajni, Richard, Neelan, makes it embarrassing to be alive. However, I never hungered for longevity. My mother's family's sturdy peasant genes must have prevailed, although my father left me a diabetic legacy, a nuisance. But I shouldn't complain. To compensate, I have acquired immunity to some infections, postmodernism for one, and free verse for another. I'm glad, too, I never caught, as my late brother did, the Sinhala nationalist flu. An early shot of Marxism, perhaps, took care of that. 2. This is a poem in 4 parts. 2. When I was young, I said to my friend Herbert, a fine designer of stage sets, a cook of creative genius, a treasury of lore of all things Lankan, if you'd only stuck to one thing, Herbert, you'd by now have been the top of that tree. But Pudra, how boring to stick to one thing. And now at 80, I know I've been like him, a fickle butterfly, flitting from field to field, from flower to flower. The kindest word they'll find to say of me is versatile. But do I really wish it had been different? What a bore to be the sovereign of some scholarly half-acre, crowned for a thesis on semiotics of consonant clusters in 6 George Cape poems. To change the etymological metaphor, I'm grasshopper, not ant in the old fable, or gracehopper in James Joyce's version. Writing, I have enjoyed myself, laid up no masterpieces to outlast the winter, but hope I please somebody now and then with a poem here or a play there, and if my tombstone is a footnote in small print in literary history, that's okay. 3. By time's mere flux, I'm called to play the part of patriarch I am unfitted for, but not for long, I hope. When the time comes, Ajith, prince of obituarists, will write, I know, a graceful piece, measured as always and free of flattery or fulsomeness. A pity I shan't be there to read it, though. I don't believe there's judgment after death or penal court of Yarmo. If there were, and I were called to account, what could I say in mitigation of sentence but stammer, please, sir, I tried not to be pompous ever, pretentious, sir, incomprehensible or boring. Would the judge pronounce severely, a frivolous trifler? He deserves no mercy. I sentence him to 50 years of torture, translating into Serbo-Croat the texts of Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha, of course, colleague of mine at Harvard, so I'll probably be back here with the kettles that work quickly soon enough. And finally, part 4, when you are old, you find that simple things you took for granted are no longer simple. Climbing the 3 steps to the office door is now an Everest-scaling feat. Crossing the street, a perilous odyssey. However, age has its compensations. You have grown, perhaps not wiser, but at least more prudent. You can admire a woman's charm and beauty with no possessive demons plaguing you. Books and CDs that you once cherished dearly are now burdens you're glad to shed. Even the sight of the half-empty shelves is pleasing. And so, to quote a poet I never liked, port after stormy seas. To all those friends, too many to be named, who've helped me past the whirlpools and the rocks, my heartfelt thanks. This makes 80 pentameters. The end. Thank you.
Hi everybody. I'm going to read my poems in the book, and then whatever there's time for after that, maybe 1 or 2 of the other contributors. The first poem is called Slave Lodge, Cape Town. I spent quite a few years in Cape Town some years ago, and one of the things that is there is a lodge that's detailing the activities, if you can call them activities, of the Dutch East India Company, and particularly their very particular slave trade. And I discovered there that somebody called, on the roll call, called Maria of Ceylon was held there. The slave lodge was built in 1679 to house the slaves of the Dutch East India Company. The doors of the lodge were open to free men between 8 and 9 every evening, to be used as a brothel. She is the woman who, after disappearing in the curse of a ship, finds herself newly arrived under the mountain. They call her no name, then a new name in another language. They write her name on page 472, Slave Lodge Census 1714. Maria of Ceylon, accounted for in the roll call in a pebbled courtyard where she counts stones, digs at the dirt in cracks between the stones, marks hours until the hour when the doors are opened for the pleasure of free men. No, in any language, should be understood, but she is the silenced goods and worth 3 inches of tobacco to the man who's trading her. When men with strange voices fall on her in turn, she is the woman with numbers rattling behind her teeth. Eka, Deka, Tuna, Hatara, Paha, Haya, Hata, Ata, Navaya, Dahaya, counting stones, counting shapes in the red of her eyelids, who is unravelling threads of herself. She pulls them out, lays them warp and weft on the stone floor, reweaves the fabric of her flesh. She is the woman who is waiting for the rain, waiting for the Yala monsoon to uproot her silence. This next poem is really an attempt to pull together my family history, which is based in the north of England, in Yorkshire, and in Sri Lanka. It's called Opus Tessellatum. Diminutive tesserae, bright shards of marble and glass paste, copper, cobalt, nickel, gold, and lapis lazuli. My fingers, sticky with Pliny's mortar, 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, bind the fragments of my shattered history. Terracotta cones play geometric games with pebbled stone and random shells in landscapes of enamel, where a flax dresser combs the bark of linum trees, lays it out on grass to bleach its yellow fibres linen white, breaks and swingles with the swipple of his flail. Ready for the loom, it makes a canvas for the seamstress, embroidering familiar gardens with her alphabet of stitches, who takes a pen from the fingers of the registrar and holds it like a needle above inky swirls of red and black. Her eyes close to the paper, she copies a cross-stitch to mark her name. Tessellated tails of agate boiled in sugar, stained as black as onyx, pave the path of a sea captain, landlocked by grief, who trails 3 motherless daughters across the Pennines to Yorkshire, where a boot finisher, 18 years old, abandons his waxing wheel to join a regiment of foot and wear out 13 pairs of regulation army soles to defend the British Raj. Pictographs in amethyst and turquoise set at angles catch the light in the courts of Sitawaka. A mudlier strokes the gold of his brocaded sash and dreams of grazing water buffalo in the hills of Rakwana, where a mother, haunted by a vision of an upturned rickshaw, bows her head before the wisdom of the astrologer's charts to save her unborn son. Ochre-tinted grout smooths the rough edge of voices in the family of a lawyer's daughter. She discards her burgher name for love of a Sinhala, a poet buried under too many letters of the law, a barrister paid by the poor with sacks of mangosteens. The stories coil like ammonite, are etched in epitaphs, sealed in unmarked graves, stamped on soldiers' passbooks, released from faded photographs, whispered through the centuries. I gather every bright shard, collect every broken piece, wash and polish, press them into place. The mortar is damp and yields to the touch. And finally, this last poem, I wrote the book The Unknown Soldier in 2019, and it was based on my father's experience in the war as a Sri Lankan, Ceylonese then, soldier fighting for the British Army. And I suddenly realised in the middle of getting towards the end of it that I could hear my mother's voice, who was a Yorkshire woman. And so this poem goes in the book as well. Dear Mum. Dear Mum, not a word from you until today. I was pegging out the washing and it was as if you were there next to me, reaching to fasten a sheet in loops on my washing line. You were always a say it like it is, speak as you find, no nonsense. Some might call it sharp-tongued kind of person, so your silence had surprised me. And there's no criticism implied. I'm grateful to you for teaching me to speak my mind, and for the cushion of love, the space for comfort in the crook of your arm. I've been wondering about your war years, how it felt to be the one you left behind in 1941, and all the waiting. You wrote letters. Your sister helped you with the spelling. Not your fault you were taken out of school at 13 to be the one who helped at home. What with my grandma having her mother and a sick relative to look out for. That bout of TB when you were 6 can't have helped. Nearly 2 months alone in a sanatorium, you told me, no visitors allowed, looking out for them every day. Must have been 5 years before you saw my dad again, and not knowing whether he'd survive. Not to mention his posting to Ceylon, the worry he'd decide to stay on. It was a long engagement for sure, but the wedding photo tells its own story. Head held high, you're looking round at all the guests as if to say, see, he was worth the wait. I'll write more soon. Glad you came to break the silence. I can still hear your voice, Those broad Yorkshire vowels asking me, why is your dad getting all the attention? Okay, I think there's time to do one poem from the book. Okay, this next poem is by Khasro Ponuthure. He's an emerging talent who writes in Tamil, born and lives in Jaffna in the north of Sri Lanka. He's a queer artist and activist, and he founded the Jaffna Queer Festival, an annual festival featuring queer excellence in creative and cultural sectors. Amir's lover. Amir, it has been a week today since I last saw you. A crow has been cawing for 3 days now on the branch of a plumeria in the backyard. Last Sunday, as I returned home after Salat, my neighbour Fatima's fighting rooster, its eyes reddened, lay dead beneath that same tree. An evil omen, Anar had said. A stretch of sea beside the Kabristan, an octopus removed from the push and pull of the estuary clings tightly to a slippery, moss-covered rock with its purple tentacles. Amir, we withdrew from the core of this crushing life and clung to love. Yes, we are deviants. The way Anar gazed at Salim when he boarded his boat, the way Mullah gazed when she saw her first menstrual blood stain her hands. Amir, what more can you expect of a man in the first moment of knowing love, except to gaze at you? Every grain of sand on this Kabristan beach is cursed by the tears Anar shed as she spread the salted fish to dry, thinking of Salim. One after another, every wave tries to wash it away and cannot. Amir, this is a cursed shore, just like our love. I have never seen on these Kabristan's shores the red-legged flamingos that fly from the Caribbean to the southern lands. When they told me Salim's eldest son, Abdullah, saw a pair of flamingos perched on Rasul's boat, and that in awe he called them birds of the sun, it was only you who pervaded my soul. Amir, I thought of our dream to see the doves of Bombay's suburbs through the window in your room. Yes, this sea, this sky, these birds, none of them are meant for us. That's a translation from Tamil by Nedra Rodrigo. Thank you.
So I think I need to thank everyone on behalf of my fellow co-editors for coming and for spending this time with us and for helping us launch this book. I'm going to read my 3 poems from the book first. In the first poem, the title is called Udeville, Nightfall, and Udeville is just the name of the place where I used to live. As the night descends quickly again, a thick curtain drawn across the sky, floating over the scent of jasmine, something else, a smell my body wants to run from. In the heavy silence sheathing the land, a weaver bird hurries to its nest. Houses are shuttered, showing no light. On the empty street, black tar cools. I am like a ghost, hovering over this vacuum of non-life. It is 6 p.m. Curfew has begun in this vacuum of non-life. I am like a ghost, hovering over the empty street as black tar cools. Houses are shuttered, showing no light. A weaver bird hurries to its nest. In the heavy silence sheathing the land, my body wants to run from something else, a smell floating over the scent of jasmine. A thick curtain is drawn across the sky as the night descends quickly again. The next poem that's in the book, it's quite hard to read in a way because I've used transliterated Tamil words within the English poem with the translation on the side, so I'm just going to have to read it and translate as I go along. It's called Sinhala Only Act 1956, and in 1956 Tamil was demoted in Sri Lanka from being an official language, and so Tamil people weren't able to fill in birth certificates, death certificates, and the language itself was outlawed. There were protests, and eventually the law was repealed. There are a couple of things to note. Halfway through the poem I say R's, E's and U's. Those are the first three vowels in the Tamil alphabet. And I mentioned the Tolkappiyam, which is the earliest written Tamil grammar, which was written about between 10 BCE and 5 BCE, and it's a cornerstone of Tamil literature. So, bear with me, I hope it sort of works. The Sinhala Only Act 1956. Tamil words that lilt, soothing as a lullaby on a mother's breath. Their Isayoli melody, nourishing our uir, life. A life force marked on a stave imagined a millennia ago. In whispers of promises they show themselves as Pardo songs, and Kathe stories, and Kavide poetry. Our generations were formed by their fluid Natyam dance, our voices tuned to their scripted Sangeetham hymns. And when we dreamed, our dreams erupted in R's and E's and U's, building blocks of a nation now without a homeland, a people now without a place. And when in 56 they tried to silence your innise, your sweet melody, gag your uyiroli vowels, and eradicate your meyeladal consonants, we took to the streets, carrying your unme, your truth, as our arms. Warriors of the Tolkappiyam on gold-face green, paying with our blood for your right to be. Orunadilla the Arkal, a people without a country, in exile, bearing the music of your beauty still. And this is the final of my poems. My grandfather's house. There is moss growing in the bedrooms of my grandfather's house, green and sticky, staining the walls and the floor with shades of the sea. They climb, tracing intricate patterns around brown squares where pictures used to hang. The roof has fallen in. Water stagnates on a cushioned floor as disturbed bats circle, drawing the night in. The rooms are empty of all that was him. The doors have been locked, walked and unwilling to open onto a tomorrow which does not contain him. It is 6 o'clock, and the mosquitoes gather noisily in rooms that once smelt of sweet margosa leaves. They are the music makers, the sum total of our dreams, the inheritors of rooms that reek and sweat in angry dismay. There is moss growing in the bedrooms of my grandfather's house, and raindrops sing a lament on deserted floors. I thought, so that's mine out of the way, thankfully. So far more exciting is all the lovely people we have in the book. And I thought I'd read you a poem by someone called Tashiana Handy, who is a young poet. She's a performance poet based in Colombo. She writes in English, and her first collection, A History of Want, explores the intimate histories of migration, grief and violence. This poem is called C189. It's about the domestic workers who make up a huge section of the Sri Lankan workforce, mainly made up of women. So you've got them working within the country, but also going out to places like the Middle East and East Asia. And they don't have many rights. In 2020, they tried to rewrite the constitution to include some rights, and this poem is based on that. C189. Do not make their house your home. It is not. Memorize every crevice, every corner, every crack, and plant your body there. It's simple. Just another chain in the industry. Balance the break-evens on your back, as if your life depends on it. And your life does depend on it. Do not let them see you sleeping. Work till your hands bleed. Work till your bloodline drips down to your feet. Work till it's clean. Know that no one will know of your existence. Don't you know they are dealing with the history of slavery and subjugation, a history of want and women. We are sorry, but your struggle is not struggle enough. Come back tomorrow. You are not an exception. You are the backbone of this economy, so act like it. You cannot afford to break. You cannot afford to bear the pain of everyone who came before you and who will come out of you. Remember, they are not of you. They are not your children. You left your children in the arms of someone else, cradled by their motherland in the absence of their mother. Consider this atonement for your sins. If you are tired or growing old, you do not age. Your body does not wither like everyone else. If by chance it does, sweep the dust away from your bones and bury it in the floor. Pour concrete into every opening. Hammer together the joints that no longer work. Build a firm foundation. You are the house we stand upon. And I'll just end on a slightly lighter note. One of my translations of a Tamil poet who was born in 1931, died in 1975. He was, his name was K. Sinnadurai, but he wrote by many pen names. The most popular of the ones he used was called Neelavanan, and that's what we've included in the book. He was born in the Eastern Province in Sri Lanka. He was a teacher, and he really did foster the younger poets who came through the northern and eastern Tamil landscape. He was widely published, and he often wrote about eastern Sri Lanka, Batticaloa and that sort of area. This poem is about something called muringakai, which is a vegetable, which is, in English it's called drumstick. And it's sort of very long and thin and looks like the things you beat drums with. And you cook it with coconut and turmeric, and it's a mild curry and some green chilies maybe. And it's really, really gorgeous. So, muringakai. At the end of a long day, a poem hovered promisingly. I made a coffee and opened my notebook. Then she called to me. "What is it?" I said. "I bought some prawns for our curry, juicy as ripe tamarind, but they really do need muringakai to make them delicious." You know the tree by the entrance? Right at the top hang 1, 2, maybe 3 long juicy moringakais. It's not too high. You could reach it standing on 1 leg. Go, please, and gather some for our curry. I could have refused, but that would have curtailed the promise of these nights. So I complied. I climbed the moringa tree, as she wished, but alas, broke it and fell to the ground. And the poem that had been hovering, it disappeared somewhere within this bed. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. There's been laughter, there's been a sense of heartbreak, there's been such a sense of bringing some histories into conversations with each other and bringing them to this moment in ways that we far too rarely get to do here. So I'm so grateful to you for sharing all of those works with us. And as the 3 editors, I suppose a lot of these decisions that you were making with the book must have been done very collaboratively. Yeah. Not to mention that the book is dedicated to the people of Sri Lanka. So just starting with that opening, I wondered why that was an important decision for you, and what place does poetry have in everyday life in Sri Lanka, for Sri Lankan people?
Yeah, poetry is very, very important to Sri Lankans. I mean, everyone grows up with poetry, basically. If you're Tamil, you recite Thiruvalluvar from the age of 4. And he's a very old poet who has all these aphorisms and rules for life, and you know, you're brought up with it. Sitting round after dinner and having your grandparents speak to you in riddles and wordplay. It's all part of the culture. And I think poetry is quite vibrant also in Sri Lanka, and all through the Troubles, the one thing that kept going was poetry. I mean, novel writing and playwriting, it sort of died a death, but poetry carried on, and important collections were published during that time. So I think we had to dedicate it to the people of Sri Lanka, because we sort of felt like we were archaeologists sort of bringing out these gems, and we didn't want those voices to be silent. And it's not about us, it's about the people within the book, really.
Yeah, just on that theme of the intergenerational nature of the book, so you've recovered some of the poets that perhaps have never been published in English before. Are there new translations? Are there poets who that you grew up with, you know, worshipping and reading and learning from, and then you've got a mid-generation of diaspora, and then younger voices as well that you're bringing in. So what are the kind of themes that we should be looking for? How do those voices change across time? Do they share commonalities, or how can we become attuned to those differences?
Well, I think for me what was very heartening and inspiring is that across all those generations there are all kinds of themes that connect with each other. So all the poets are really writing about collecting something for a meal, for instance, the poem that Shash just read, as well as writing about trauma, as well as writing about difficulties in their personal life. So for me that said something really about the way that poetry exists in the world. It exists in the world to say everything we need to say about our lives, whatever generation we're living in, whenever we grew up. So that was that was really heartening to me. Don't know about how you felt.
Yeah, no, that's such a hopeful thing to say, and it sort of puts conflict, violence and war in its place in a way. because there is love, there is desire, there is hunger, there is actual, root vegetables. I love that. But, in the introduction to the book, you do write quite honestly about some of the curatorial questions and challenges that you faced as a group. So could you talk a little bit about how you resolved those in terms of the schisms in attitudes and languages and terminology and things that you had to face? Because these are big political questions which have caused conflict.
Sure, I can say a bit about that. And so this was put together during the pandemic years, and we talk on Zoom most weeks, and actually that was something that was very important for me, that friendship with my co-editors. And sometimes we would have quite intense disagreements about the content of the book, and I think one reason we're such good friends now is, as Seni suggested earlier today, because we've had those arguments. And I think that there were so many times that there were sort of politically sensitive matters. Like, for instance, do you want to include a poet who actually was a Tamil tiger? Who actually she wrote about toting a gun around and so on. What sort of morality or what sort of ethics do you bring to the work of anthologizing? But then also questions like, should you be including a poet's most Sri Lankan poems? What does that even mean? If a poet has written a poem and it's about a serious historical event, really traumatic event, but you don't think it's a very good poem compared to their other poems, what do you do? And this very much had to be handled on a case-by-case basis. I think we did want, I think it's important to all of us that this poetry, even though it is often a poetry of witness, and especially the Tamil poems, I think, it is also it is art. And I think it's very important that we think of these writers as writers, like not just sort of wounds with tongues in them, to use the Shakespearean metaphor, and I think that in general, the study of post-colonial world literature, global South literature, including the study of fiction, tends to really treat it like a kind of journalism or something, rather than to respect the artfulness of it. So I think that's something that brought us all together. We all care very much about poetry as an art form, and we could bring different things to the table. I mean, Shash has this wonderful, deep knowledge of Tamil poetics and so on, but it's something that we all care about very much.
I mean, you've touched on so many of the things that I wanted to ask you about there. This kind of palisading that happens in literary categorization, where modernism is very protected as a sort of category. It's not allowed to be global. It's not allowed to include brown and black voices. And I think, for me, just to air a bugbear, particularly British ones. So I'm wondering how important it was for you to basically bring together all of these different kinds of styles and crafts and forms, just to make the point that this cannot be only understood in this way. Or was that not something that you thought consciously about till afterwards? Anyway.
Oh, you want to go for it? You go for it, Seni.
I mean, just to follow on from what Vidyan was saying, I know that we had a discussion very early on that it was the poem, it was the craft of the poem that was going to be important in the book, that we weren't putting anything in because we thought it was something that had to be spoken about. It had to be a good poem, basically. So no matter how, we wanted some diversity in it, and personally, I didn't want to be the only gay in the book, really, and so I was, really wanting to. And I can remember there was one submission that we got, and it was definitely, a very openly gay writer, and the poems were just not good enough. And I remember saying in the meeting, this is a gay poem, and I really wish it was good enough, and it's not. So it has to go. So that was the difficulty of the decisions that we made, really, that's what it was, really, and it was about the sense that we, as you know, wherever we're from in the world, we have a right to write about whatever we want, you know,
and in the form that you want,
and in the form that we want, and to have all of that together felt like a very important statement to be making.
Having said that, I think also. Also with Tamil poets, you don't have that freedom. So I do have to disagree with Seni on that you have a sense of responsibility and you are bearing witness. And yes, you need to produce a good poem, and there were many Tamil poets who we couldn't include because the translations were just not good enough. And I couldn't spend any more time translating anymore because it would have been very boring for the reader as well. So we didn't, but it is all very well to say a poet has the freedom to write what they want, but when you're caught up in events that are, and you're being silenced by your government, and you feel it's your responsibility to talk about these things, then no, you don't have the freedom, you just have to do it because you're fighting for a great cause.
Yeah, and this question of who gets to decide what kind of poem it is and whether it belongs in a certain category or not. There's a kind of bearing witness, and then there's a sort of formal criticism that wants to say, oh yes, it's good on these terms or those terms. And then there are the publishers, not Blood Axe obviously, or this book, who want only the trauma or only the violence or only the kind of diaspora becomingness. And I think that's endlessly reductive, but I think, Shash, you do make the point as well that there is a place for these witnessing poems, and it's a kind of way of saying, if you do appreciate and enjoy this beautiful art form, you therefore can't look away from violence. There's a sense that now you know, and so poetry does make something happen there. Do you think that's a fair point?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, just one thing, like, you know, I agree with so much has been said. I don't know if I'm really answering the question or not, but something that occurred to me is a theme or something that interconnects quite a few of the poems is actually a kind of sense of humour, I realise. And that's why Shash ending on that poem is a great example of that. But there is a kind of gallows humour, a kind of bleakly resilient humour, a kind of how do you even talk about this stuff kind of humour, and that's something that it's always kind of been there in my family. I never really know where it came from. And then when working, you know, my brilliant co-editors and putting the poems together, it's sort of seeing that in different kinds of poems. I do see it in the Tamil poems, I see it in the Anglophone poems. I think I see a bit of it in the Sinhala poems, maybe a little bit. So I don't think that has any connection to the question whatsoever. It's just what was on my mind. Sorry, Preti.
Yeah, no, but I want to ask you about this black humour thing. Do you want to add something?
I was just going to say that Neil at Blood Axe gave us complete freedom, so we didn't feel any sort of editorial impetus coming through, or that we were being constrained in any way, that we could pick the poems we wanted. We didn't have to justify our choices to anybody other than to ourselves, and there were three of us, and often if we had disagreements, there was the majority rules. We did settle quite a few arguments that way.
Yeah, there were three of us, so that was useful actually. There were three of us. If there'd have been two, it might have been a little bit more difficult. Yeah.
I love how personal this gets while we're dealing with this like political history and
yeah.
Well, it's kind of so it's kind of like you could have very similar values. I think actually if our values were radically different, that would be hard. But you can have similar values but have different interpretations on the best way of achieving those values. And I think that between the three of us as editors, we do have that kind of productive tension. And also just an interest in very different kinds of poems. You know, like I'm very interested in, though I could never write it myself, the kind of post-lyric hybrid work that a lot of young poets are doing now. And we have some great examples of that in this book by up-and-coming young poets. We also have some beautiful I mean, some people consider them old-fashioned, but I think they're beautiful, formal poems written in English by poets from Sri Lanka, you know, poets people will never have read, poems, whose books are out of print. We have sort of modernist experimentation, you know, we have sort of all sorts. So again, I've lost the thread of what I was talking.
No, but you have brought me to something else that you talk about quite carefully, which is the persisting inheritance of English as a language that poets are using formally in an older generation, but perhaps making evolutions and revolutions with through the book. Can you say a bit more about that and the politics of that?
Yeah.
What we realised that there is a certain sense of Sri Lankan English that we discovered was prevalent, and we didn't want to silence that, even though sometimes it did start to grate on us because we were reading so much of this stuff. And that is slightly antiquated, but it's authentic for the place. And also, a lot of Sri Lankan poets write in English follow the Sinhala and the Tamil way of writing poems, which is very short line lengths. So you have very long and very thin poems that go on for pages, but could really be shortened and tightened into sort of a page. So we did work with some poets to say, look, do you mind if we just rejig a few of your lines and maybe talk about line breaks a bit and where to end, and why is there an A, just an A on a line, you know, why? So in that way we had to learn as well, and we had to respect that this is just the way things are done there. But sometimes we put our foot down and said, no, actually we're changing.
Well, the book could have been 900 pages,
Yeah.
you know, whatever, you know. It just practically wasn't possible. So, but that was a really good experience, actually working with particularly some of the younger poets who sent in stuff to us, to be able to contact them and then have a discussion with them about it and say, well, you know, how about trying this? And then they take it away and come back to us with a relineated poem, and that was a really, so it became more than collecting poems for an anthology. It became, as we said in the introduction, you know, a kind of mentoring process as well in some cases, which was, you know, really important. And yeah, and I just do need to say, and you know, we're going to bring some of our, that I actually really totally agree with Shash, don't disagree with her about the poems of witness. I think the poems of witness were, for us, they were a crucial part of the whole book. But we also did agree that we didn't want poems of witness in there again if they were not expressed in a way that was actually going to kind of be useful in the book or to come across in the book. So that was, you know, the key thing really for all of us.
Yeah, we weren't going to peddle trauma porn, were we?
No, we sort of about the lineation. You know, we spent a long time talking about lineation. It occurs to me that sometimes I sort of was challenged out of my own preconceptions by the poetry I read. Actually, one of the poems in translation that Seni just read, I remember the first time I encountered that poem and I thought, why are the lines so short? But I think reading it again, hearing you read it, I begin to understand that, you know, the way that we get congealed inside these sort of creative writing norms, also Anglo-American creative writing norms, and you start to think that that's some kind of definitive poetics or aesthetics or something like that. So I think I learned a lot sometimes from reading poems.
Yeah, and this is the kind of care I was talking about when I was introducing the book that's gone into this. It's so rich and there's so much to learn from it. So we do have a few minutes for audience questions. So if you do have any questions, please wave vigorously. Yes. There is a mic coming to you.
Hi, thank you so much, all three of you, for creating such an amazing book. I was wondering, and this is not going to generate a short answer, but maybe like trying to condense it down. Don't want to teach grammar to suck eggs, obviously. But what qualified as good? How did you figure out what was good?
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, I was the one who said it, wasn't I? Yeah. Well, for me, if a poem speaks from the poet's heart to mine, then it works for me. So that's that's a kind of really a bit of a glib answer, I know, but I think it's really hard. I don't have rules and regulation. I don't know if either of you do about, well, these are the things I'm looking for, the tick boxes to know. But when I see a poem and read a poem, I know that it's working as a poem and not as a piece of polemic or just a thought thrown down on a page that's not been thought about very much or whatever. And I think to sort of apply rules and regulations to it really, for me, doesn't work. I don't know if it works for either of you, but to sort of say, well, if it's got this and this, then it works. There is something about the sort of authenticity of the voice of the poet, you know, that they're actually that they're speaking in a kind of language and a rhythm that's a kind of a truth of their own, really, that then I respond to. And that's, you know, that might not be out.
I think there are certain building blocks you use when you write a poem, and just simplifying it in a big way. And if we found poets using some of them well, or effectively, or surprisingly, or making us think, well, that's a good poem. On top of what Seni said about the authenticity of the voice and things. I mean, I was really caught up with line lengths and line endings for translations, because if a translation doesn't speak to the target language, then it's failed to cross over from the source to the target. So the translations that failed were still mired in either Tamil or Sinhala and weren't travelling over to English. So in that way you could tell a good translation from a bad translation.
Actually, I just need to say on that if we had been able to put in some of the translations from Tamil that we had, and then the retranslations by Shash, that would answer your question. Because what she did was she translated them into poems, whereas what we had some of the time were accurate translations, but they weren't poems. And of course we couldn't do that, we couldn't put them in, but I'm just saying that would actually illustrate what I was trying to say, because, yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great answer. Yeah, I would talk about it really concretely like that, that there might be a book of translations of the Tamil poets, say, and I find myself skimming over certain poems, and then when I read those poems, retranslated, sometimes by Shash, and think, wow, that's just extraordinary. And there's something there that was there in that translation that was not there in the previous translation. So I don't know if that's satisfying to sort of defer the question of aesthetic quality onto something that one can perceive through variant translations. That seems to be what we've roughly come up with.
Yeah, it's a combination of sort of craft and feeling. Any other questions? Yes. Gentleman in the blue shirt. Oh, well, first this. Oh, okay, first we'll go here and then we'll come back to you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask about the Aragelia Portam, because obviously the introduction to the book talks about last year's struggles in Sri Lanka, and you say that you didn't rush to include poems from that period. But I guess I wonder if you did include any poems. And you had, for example, Indran's poems in Ground Views. You have his from Civil War, obviously, in the book, but I didn't know if you included any from the Aragelia. Thank you.
I'm not sure if in the end we did include any poems specifically about. I think there is a, how to put it, like when events are occurring that are obviously so important, there's this totally understandable impulse to want to write to the moment and get something out there. And, you know, in canonically that has resulted in some poems we now think of as great, like, you know, extempore fusions and so on. But it also does result in a lot of poems which are essentially quite prosaic, and they are kind of helplessly angry screeds rather than something that is more lyrically achieved, if that's anything. So I think we were open to the idea of including some sort of new work that did address those issues if we found anything, but we just didn't really find anything. I think there's also an issue here, I think of a lot of, we noticed certain habits amongst Sri Lankan writers, like maybe they felt very isolated, they didn't really have a community of writers around to help them. I think maybe some of them had reacted to being culturally marginalized by overproduction. In fact, I would say that possibly the most important Anglophone Sri Lankan poet, Jean Arasanayagan, is an example of this, in that her books got more and more formless and seemingly unedited and so on. So in that sense, we were also working with the ways in which a writer's overall career is shaped by the audience that they feel is available to them. And sometimes I felt that you could really see the disadvantages that certain poets writing from the margins wrote out of. I don't know how coherent that was.
Yes, lady, the back there, yes.
Cheers. Well, firstly, thank you so much for being here to speak today. It was brilliant to hear you all speak and to hear some of the poems being read out loud, because it's always just such a fantastic thing to hear and to experience it that's you can't quite capture from a page. So firstly, thank you. But then secondly, I wondered, how did you navigate doom in the sense of some of the poems and some of the writings that you were taking from came from such, well, periods filled with doom, so to speak. I mean, from, as you yourself were saying, between the Troubles to then even more modernly, with last year's Troubles to even things like the pandemic. Those periods in time have so much doom within them, and yet you've managed to balance pretty well between, oh God, this is awful, between there are moments of beauty. I was just wondering how yourselves felt that journey went. Thank you.
Thank you, great question.
It's a bit of a mirror of the journey that we all went through in a way. I mean, we started doing this book in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and we were all in that, in that same state of being, and we were all, we were all doing that thing that maybe a lot of people did, where you were kind of trying to balance the doom with the joy. And, there were times when we'd sort of share cake on Zoom sort of thing, and just have kind of normal, we'd be talking about the book and then we'd sort of morph into having a normal conversation about something really quite everyday, really, and share kind of good moments that were happening in our personal lives and then difficult moments that were happening now. But so it became about everything, really. It wasn't just the book, and maybe that's why the book reflects that. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you two.
I think my journey with the book was I started off with black hair, then I ended up with grey. So it really did take its toll on me, especially translating. And I became very interested on the trauma felt by translators when they're translating traumatic material, because even though I carry my own trauma, which I have a very weird relationship with Tamil, which is like another show altogether, but having to negotiate my own baggage while dealing with other people's baggage, and it was relentless. I mean, I think I've translated like 45 poems, and in a very short space of time. And by the end of it, I did have sort of a collapse sort of thing. And I wasn't sleeping at one point. I'd be on emailing them at like 3 in the morning because I just couldn't sleep. I couldn't switch off. So it was quite traumatic.
But you're the most amazingly productive person. Like when Shash says she can't sleep, it means that she'll be doing spreadsheets at night. So wake up in the morning, everything will have been brilliantly tabulated. The explanation is Shash couldn't sleep last night. So we're several months ahead of schedule now. I don't know. I think that's a really good question. It feels like maybe there's another question inside it, which is if you do an anthology, a national-ish anthology of poetry, is it the best poems as you see it from that nation and its diaspora, or is it that plus a feeling for what the overall book will be like? Like, are you creating a kind of readerly experience? Are you mindful of that as anthologists? And I think to a certain extent we were. Like, we made decisions like to do it alphabetically, for instance. So we mix up the Tamil and the Sinhala poets and the Anglophone poets because we didn't want to silo them off in an equivalent of the political siloing. So to that extent it was randomized. But then we also go through it and we kind of see what would the reader experience moving from this poem to another poem, to a different poem. And what you say about doom, it really interests me because I think we may have moved from a literary position where doom felt obligatory, right? So it's like serious writing is about bad stuff and it's about pain and it's about suffering. And as an academic, I came through this idea that, one was supposed to feel aggrieved at Keats for writing a beautiful poem about autumn when he was supposed to be angrily tweeting about the Peterloo massacre. But then when I put this to my students, they're like, but you need self-care, right? You need to have moments out where there's pleasure and so there is a shift there that it can become joy can become politically acceptable in terms of an overall trajectory. And I think we did want some of that in the book. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say that I started with grey hair and finished with grey hair, and that's a testament to the fact that I've lived a longer life than these two, and I've learned, I think, in that long life that the need to carry doom and joy together is the only way that you can survive. So that's what I felt about what the book has to do. Really, it has to show that the survival is speaking out and witnessing things is part of your survival, and showing that the reason it's so bad that these things happen to people is because there are these ordinary lives that are being disrupted. So we need to talk about the ordinary lives that people would have had if these things hadn't happened. So, yeah.
Well, we have got time to carry on conversations. It is a few minutes past 8, so please stay, buy the book, chat to the poets, get your book signed, and carry all the joy of this event that you have helped us create by launching out of Sri Lanka this extraordinary collection with these 3 incredible poet, writers, editors. Thank you.